Been interested in meteorology and climatology because as a little girl she was scared of weather, so she decided to do something about it and she studied meteorology. Melissa, is it Widhalm? Pronounced that way? Melissa Widhalm is an operations manager at the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. She serves as the program coordinator for the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, which is a statewide effort to understand climate change risks in the Hoosier State. Melissa has a Bachelor of Science degree in meteorology from Northern Illinois University and a Master of Science degree in Natural Resource Science from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Melissa has been at Purdue University since 2011, and her interests include applied climate science, science communication, public engagement, and project management. She was born and raised in Illinois. Melissa currently resides in West Lafayette, where she spends her free time baking, reading, and spending time with her husband and 2 children. So, Melissa, it's all yours.
It's up there.
It's up there? No. Well, hello, everyone.
Hi.
I'm a little bit short for standing behind a podium, so I'm going to stand over here. Maybe I'll wander. We'll see what happens.
You can come out front.
I'm not going to go that far. So thank you so much, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
I'm making it.
Jim, when you said that I was afraid of the weather as a child, that was really an understatement. I think terrified is more appropriate way to describe it, to the point where I would cry and make myself sick. And so I feel like I've come a long way to be able to understand the weather, go outside and enjoy the rain, do all of those fun things. I even went storm chasing a few times. Wouldn't recommend that. And now I've come full circle to where each and every day I get to think about and talk about Indiana's weather and climate and our changing climate, which can be a bit overwhelming. It can be a bit scary, a different kind of fear than I had when I was scared as a 5-year-old about the weather. But even though this is a really big topic, it can sometimes feel controversial. It can sometimes bring out a lot of feelings in people. It can be scary. But I do it every day because I have little kids. I just want this to be a better place for them. And I know you guys have a strong message of improving the world for our children. So I feel like we're all sort of working towards the same thing here. So I really am happy to be here. When Jim asked me to come and talk about the state of our climate, he said, can you come and tell us about what are we actually seeing in the data, and why does there seem like there's just so much argument and confusion over what's going on? And I said, well, great, I'd be happy to. He said, okay, we have about a half an hour for you. I said, oh boy, that's a big topic for a half an hour. So I said, okay, I'll do the best I can to keep this short, leave plenty of time for questions. And I do want to say, you know, since it is such a big topic, if there are other questions you guys have, if you ever want to have me back or somebody else from the Climate Change Research Center, please give us a call. We're a resource here to help in our community and in our state, okay? So before I jump into talking about observations and perceptions of our warming world, I want to zoom out for just a little perspective. Give us a starting point here instead of zoomed in right here into this room. Okay, so what we're looking at here are 2 globes with 2 balls on top. And on the left, I don't know if this pointer will work on the screen, on the left, that blue ball actually represents all of the water on Earth. So if you took all of the water in the oceans, in the ice, in our bodies, in the plants, in the ground, you crammed it all together, it would fill a ball that size. So it's kind of a fragile, thin layer when we look at it like this. Now on this other side, in this pink ball, that actually represents our atmosphere. So if you took all of the air from the ground up to the top of the atmosphere all around the Earth, and you shoved it into one balloon and stuffed it down at sea level, that's the size of the balloon. That's how big the balloon would fill. So we can see our atmosphere is also a very thin and fragile layer. And we're all breathing and walking and driving and flying and running our factories and doing all of that stuff inside our little pink balloon. All 7 billion of us. So when we start to think about the atmosphere in this way, it's a lot easier to see and understand that we could actually be having an effect on the gases in that balloon. All right, especially those heat-trapping gases, which is what we'll jump into talking about. So it's easy to understand now, yes, we could be having an impact, and we are having an impact. So all of that flying and driving and running our factories and growing our food, that's converted billions of tons of fossil fuels like coal and oil and gas into carbon dioxide. And as we keep putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's a kind of long-lived gas, the concentration of that gas goes up. And so since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we've actually increased the concentration of this gas by about 40%. So what I'm showing you here in this graphic, the white line is showing us the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back for 130 years. And the blue squiggly line, that's showing the year-to-year temperature change of the world going back 130 years. And what we can see is that they very closely track one another. As we have more heat-trapping gas, the Earth gets warmer. And that's not really a very new concept. Scientists actually discovered the connection between heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide and the temperature of the Earth back in 1850. Okay, so this is a relationship in physics that we've known about for a very, very long time. So if we want to look at this in a different way, look at our temperatures in a different way, what I'm showing here is how much Earth's temperature for each year was above or below a long-term average. Okay, so this is going from 1880 is where it starts, all the way up to 2014. So I think Jim was telling me that your club was founded in 1816, right? So we were, or sorry, 1916. So it was about here, okay? So we can see that temperatures over the last century have been rising rapidly. And that's as we've been increasing that concentration of gas in the atmosphere. So when this graphic was first developed, it was 2014. It had just been named the hottest year on record during that period. But since then, 2015 was named the hottest year on record. But then 2016 was named the hottest year on record. Thankfully, 2017 and 18 were not the hottest years on record, but they certainly kept pace with the trend in the observations that we are measuring. Okay, so ranking third and fourth warmest in our observational record. Last year, 2018, also marked the 42nd consecutive year of temperatures above the long-term average.
What is that? What's the long-term, what is the average?
The average temperature of the Earth, this is showing how much away from the average. So the average temperature of the Earth is like 63 or 64 degrees.
So we've gone up
something
a
like
degree
that.
and a half above 60 something.
That's right.
Okay.
So a degree of change, or 2 or 3, it might not sound very big, but it actually is quite significant. So you have to remember, we're not talking about the weather. Okay, so day to day, we know our weather can change wildly. Heck, hour to hour, it can change many, many degrees. What we're talking about is our climate. Okay, so that's the long-term average of conditions in a location. Why do climate scientists talk about the average? They do that because it's very, very stable. Okay, so it only fluctuates a few tenths of a degree in the course of a year when we look at it over that long time period of a year. Okay, so we look at the long-term average because it helps us see past that noisy variability of our weather, and it really gives us a clear picture if there are any trends or changes in the system. So it's a very useful tool to have to understand if anything's changing or if it's not changing and staying the same. So this problem, though, that we're seeing, it goes beyond just changing temperatures, okay? We have observations that show our temperatures are warming, but this is an interconnected system that we're talking about, okay? So as we start tinkering with one piece of it, temperature, we have rippling effects on all sorts of other components in our environment. Okay, so the amount of moisture that we can hold in the air, that changes when you change the temperature. The amount of ice that you have on mountaintops. Okay, so we've been for decades, over a century now, we've been taking these environmental measurements, and so we know that the Arctic sea ice is melting. It's melting at a pace of about 13% per decade decline. We know that the ice is thinning. We know that the seas are rising. We have physical measurements that we've been taking, and we know this. We know that in 1910, when Glacier National Park was founded, we had 150 active glaciers, and today we have 25. Okay, so all of these things are being measured and monitored by scientists in our federal government across 13 different agencies, as well as independent scientists from universities across the U.S. and in other parts of the world too. And so we have these multiple lines of evidence that all point to a very similar conclusion, that our world is warming. And it's not just changes in key indicators in faraway places. We have data and measurements that we've been taking right here in Indiana that we can see over the last century, Indiana has warmed about 1.2 degrees. Remember, we're not talking about the weather, we're talking about the climate. And so a measure of change of 1 or 2 or 3 degrees translates to some pretty dramatic shifts in the local weather patterns. And so with our 1 degree of warming, we've already seen a growing season that's about 2 to 3 weeks longer than it used to be. We have fewer frequency of extreme cold days. We don't get rid of cold days. I mean, we are a northern climate, right? We're going to still have winter, but it's different than it was 50 or 100 years ago. And our warming overnight temperatures, there's something that doesn't get very much attention. Our overnight temperatures have risen much more rapidly than the average. If you're a farmer, warming overnight temperatures have big implications on crop yields, on pests and disease, human health. All of these things link back to our day-to-day lives. Here in Indiana, not only are we seeing changes in our temperature, but we are seeing changes in our rainfall. I would argue the changes we're seeing in our rainfall are more dramatic and probably more important in our daily lives than what we've been seeing in temperature. So over the last century, on average, we have about 5.5 inches more rainfall in Indiana than we did a century ago. And if we look at that, the map is showing us different regions of the state. There's places in southern Indiana that have 7 inches more rainfall in a year now than they did in a year a century ago. So we already are a pretty wet state. We're already dealing with quite a bit of water. This is just adding to that management challenge. And it's not just that we're seeing more rainfall, but the nature of storms themselves have shifted. So we're seeing heavy rainfall events that are becoming more intense and happening more frequently. When we look at the station data here in Indiana, many of the stations are showing an increase in the number of 2-inch rainfall events, and the number of 3-inch rainfall events, 4-inch rainfall events. Those are happening more frequently. If you look at our stream flows across the state, the majority of those are showing increased flows at most times in the year. as we get more higher stream flows, our risk of flooding increases, especially our risk of wintertime flooding. Okay, we've seen that in this part of the state the last few years. So based on all of this information, the bottom line is that we have overwhelming scientific evidence that our climate is changing and that human activities are contributing to this change. And based on that evidence, at least 18 scientific societies in the United States have put out statements affirming the reality of our changing climate. These are groups like the American Medical Association, the National Academies of Science. We also have information on individual scientists and what kind of conclusions they made from analyzing the data or their perceptions of other people's analysis of the data. And what that research shows is that between 90 to 100% of scientists agree that human-caused global warming is happening. So you might say, well, 90 to 100, why is there a range? Why isn't it 100 if that's what the data is showing? Well, what we find is that it's really based on their expertise in climate science. The greater a scientist's expertise and knowledge in that area, the higher their agreement is with that statement that our climate is changing due to human activities. You can liken this to having some kind of medical problem. You go see your primary care doctor. Your primary care doctor says, well, it could be a couple things. I'm going to send you to a specialist. Why do they send you to a specialist? Because they specialize in that problem you're having, right? So you're going to get a better diagnosis, more accurate diagnosis. That's why they send you to the specialist. So the same kind of thing is happening here. Okay, so the greater your knowledge and expertise in climate science, the greater your agreement is that the data are showing that our climate is changing. Now what gets really interesting is we have similar data on the public, okay, so non-scientists. And so if you ask adults in the US, about 70% say they think our climate is changing. But just 57% say that it's due to humans. If we look at that for Indiana, the numbers are a little bit different. So here was the US, 70% and 57%. And here in Indiana, 64% think that climate change is happening and 51% think that it's due to human activity. Now it gets even more interesting. If you ask people, this goes back to adults in the US, if you ask people what they think about the scientists, if they think there's agreement in the scientific community, remember we just looked at it, 18 societies have put out statements saying, we looked at the data, this is what we conclude is happening. 90 to 100%, nearly 100% if you're a climate scientist will say, we agree this is happening. But when you ask people, just 49% of people think that the scientific community agrees that our climate is changing. So there's this mismatch with what we see in the data and what we analyze in the data and what people perceive to be happening with that data. So why is that? Okay, why is it that there's this mismatch in the data and people's perceptions? Well, this is an extremely big topic, and I know I have just a few minutes remaining, so I'm going to just touch on some things, somewhat surprising things that we've learned in the recent years about climate change denial. And I'm just going to scratch the surface. I can certainly share with you additional reading and resources if you're curious. Oh yeah, that's 43% Indiana. So the first thing that people often will say when we're talking about this mismatch in the data and the perceptions is, well, it's got to be a knowledge gap. If people just had the data and knew the facts, they'd change their opinions. Well, for the U.S. as a whole, there's research that shows there's actually no correlation between how much a person knows about climate science, so we call that science literacy, and their views on climate change. No correlation. In fact, what we find is that the strongest predictor of a person's view on climate change is actually their political affiliation. So this has become such a politicized topic that what you believe about climate change doesn't reflect what you know, it reflects who you are. Okay, and this is not a good thing. So this has been framed as an us versus them kind of issue, okay? People are forced into taking sides with either the scientific community or their own personal community. We've been assigning toxic cultural meanings to a person's climate change beliefs and using those meanings as a badge of honor and affiliation and membership and loyalty to our own groups. Right? So this belief in climate change is just so entangled with our identities and who we are that having more knowledge, having the data, having the facts, isn't what's going to help people close that gap with what we see in the scientific data. Okay, so that's pretty surprising information, and it makes it very difficult to bridge that gap. Okay, another factor contributing to this mismatch is that when we talk about large, complex, slow-moving problems, they're just difficult to grasp. Okay, it's hard to wrap our brains around it. And when something feels too big to process, for many of us, self-preservation kicks in, and we use denial as a coping mechanism. Okay, just think about what the scientists are telling us. The scale of the problem and the scale of the solutions feels overwhelming. Okay? And I think often people have these emotional responses to hearing this traumatic information about climate change, and that gets overlooked and ignored. And so it's actually very common for people to react to information about climate change with fear and guilt and anger. And fear and guilt and anger can very easily lead you to denial. And so when we're thinking about climate change, it's not just about what the facts say, it's how we feel about those facts that move us and drive us to respond and form opinions. Okay, I'm going to touch on just one more. Yes? Got it. I'm going to touch on just one more. This one gets a little uncomfortable. Because what happens is when it comes to climate change, misinformation abounds, and it is not by accident. So for years, for decades, there has been a tremendous amount of money flowing into organizations to raise doubt and mistrust in climate science. And it's not unlike what we saw decades ago, where big tobacco industries actively shared and spread misinformation about the safety and the health benefits of smoking. Even though there was a lot of scientific data to say smoking is bad for your health and will cause you to have these illnesses. Okay, so there was a lot of mistrust and doubt and misinformation that really took decades to undo, right? Now it's sort of the standard knowledge. We know that smoking causes health problems. But it took us a lot longer to understand that and accept that than when we first understood that in the data. So consider this research from Drexel University in Pennsylvania. They found that from 2003 to 2010, mega donors like the billionaire Koch brothers and the Mercer family and fossil fuel corporations together gave over $550 million to fight or deny the existence of climate change. There was new research from a London-based nonprofit that showed just recently the 5 largest publicly traded oil and gas companies have invested over $1 billion on misleading climate branding and lobbying just in the 3 years following the Paris Agreement. During that same period, they invested $110 billion in new fossil fuel production. So it's people in groups who stand to lose money, power, status that benefit from initiating and maintaining misinformation, because shifting the status quo, shifting away from a carbon-intensive economy has very real meaningful impacts to them. If we look at the spending ratio comparing climate denial lobbying to environmental organizations, energy corporations, they're outspent by a ratio of 10 to 1. Okay, I'll skip over this next slide and just move on to the point where we say, well, who cares? Who cares what people think? If I can see the data, make the assessment for myself, why does it matter? Why should I care about what other people think? Well, it's important to care about people's feelings over this matter and how we can all come together, because the best available climate science we have tells us that the measurements and observations that we've been taking and the warming temperature trend we've been measuring is going to continue and intensify. And the level of warming directly relates back to our choices to slow or not slow the amount of carbon going into our atmosphere. So by the middle of this century, or sooner, we need to be coming together to think about bold collective action. We need to be having lively discussions about what we do about this problem, instead of whether or not this problem is a thing. Right? What do we do about this thing? How can we find solutions that help us adjust to the changes we know and measure and see that are underway? And how do we avoid the most severe impacts, right? Because at the end of the century, a 5 and a 10-degree difference in warming are two very different futures. So if we want to ensure the best future for our children, for our communities, that's where we need to be thinking about what can we do today. And it's not a hopeless situation, all right? There is time to act. People who say, oh, it's doom and gloom, it's over, that's not true. There is time to act, but we have to act urgently, and we have to act so that we ensure the best possible future. All right, I'll end it on a bit of comedy, because I love this graphic, and I think it really perfectly sums up our problem here. What if this is all a big hoax, and we create a better world for nothing? Okay? So many of the things, so many of the solutions, shutting down, dirty factories, that has immediate health benefits on the children who live in that area. Or working to have cleaner water, working to have cities that are livable and you don't have to drive as far. So many of the things that people are promoting that will reduce carbon in our atmosphere also have a lot of health benefits, also have a lot of community benefits. And so I think if we can try to have conversations on where we find common ground, where we can come together, and understanding that data and facts alone really aren't enough, right? We need to be having personal connections with people and trying to ask people why they feel the way they do and what we can do about it. I think that helps us get us on the right track. Thank you so much for your attention and your time. I'm sure there are questions. If there are things that you want to learn about for Indiana, we have this whole Indiana Climate Impacts Assessment that I didn't talk about today. You can get in contact with me and I can let you know about that project, and I guess I'll just turn it back over to you. Or for questions. All right, 2 questions. See one here.
Back when I was in school in the 50s, professors up there said population increase is going to cause this nation, the world, a terrible disaster. And I've not heard any one of you folks ever mention the increase in population. Now, in the United States, in the last so many years, we're up over millions of increase of people coming in here. And people are hot, and so they create temperature increase. And you missed the point.
So absolutely, as population goes up, we use more resources, we have more people to deal with, more people to feed, but it's important to think about the quality of life that people have across the earth. So here in the United States, we have, 330 million people, If you look at the energy we use per person, it's about 15 times higher than the energy each person uses in India, where there's 1 billion people. So absolutely, we need to be thinking about population, but it's not just how many people they are, it's how much energy does each person need. Okay? Oh, there's lots of questions. Go. Okay.
The sun is known to be a really dynamic object. Its output is not constant. To your knowledge, has there ever been a study that tries to correlate the output of the sun to what's been observed in terms of temperature rise in the Earth in the last, say, 100 years?
Absolutely. And you know what? Oh, I can't get to it on this slide. Can you go to... So what happens is you ask a wonderful question, and it's the same question that scientists at NASA have asked, right? Because obviously, human contributions to climate change are only one component of our climate system. There are a lot of things that drive the climate system. Can you pull that one up as the full screen? Okay, so I'll go through this quickly. But the folks at NASA did this study where they said, what are the things driving our climate? How do we know this isn't just the sun or volcanoes or something like that? And so what they are able to do is, this black line is the Earth's temperature, the change in Earth's temperature. And these different colored lines are when they simulate how much each of these different factors contribute to the temperature that we have. And so they looked at things like the sun's energy, the Earth's orbit, volcanoes. They looked at all of those natural factors together and found that eliminating any kind of human component, obviously we get changes in that climate, but it's not what we've been seeing, particularly over the last century. When you look at the human components, things like sulfur in the air, taking down trees, using carbon-based fuels and putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, well, that kind of overshoots it, the carbon dioxide from heat-trapping gases. Some of these other things have a cooling effect, right? When you put sulfur into the air, it's kind of like putting big shiny objects in and reflecting out that sun's energy. When you combine all those forces together, we can see that it's not until we add in that human component that we are much better able to represent the actual observations of our climate. So your question is absolutely correct. And there are definitely other factors that are way outside of our control that contribute. But the best available science that we have shows us that those are not the driving factors, particularly over the last 50 to 100 years.